So we might as well get going now.
Okay.
Towards the end of this month, I think you messaged me about it, and John had posted about it in the Slack channel. The daylight savings time.
Yes, I saw that. We're gonna be off an hour
in the US than in Europe, so we'll probably take a week off at the end of this month. I'll work out precisely which week we have to
very good
do it. But yeah, I mean, I don't want it to be I don't want there to be a week when, you know, one of us is missing because the timing's awkward and stuff, or because of not realizing that the times have changed, because everything's pinned against a Chicago time or something like that on the Alpha Data Science diary. And
one's like, it's like
the rest of the world moves around that. And I don't even know whether it's pinned to the summer time thing rather than the winter time or anything like that. But anyway, I'll what we'll do, we'll just take a week off, because I think we probably can. I mean, I don't know how. Like, I mean, I look at the book and I think that perhaps chapter 13, you know, if we get to chapter 13, we've pretty much covered the whole of the main contents of the book. There's interesting stuff in the final chapters.
I think that's polishing, though, right? These last few chapters are just kind of making your code a little bit more polished.
Yeah. So I'm happy with the pace that we're getting through the book. I know that I originally had planned to get through it, you know, 2 chapters a week, but
right.
it's, you know, it's difficult to get through 2 chapters in 1 week, and I'm about to try it again. But you did the first half of chapter 9.
That's correct.
But I think it would be a nice time to have a break anyway, because we'll have covered the chapter 10 at least, and possibly the testing and version control stuff by then. Yeah. So. Right. Anyway, if Federica isn't in the room, I'll get started. So chapter 9, you started last week, was on the kind of different ways of building prototypes for Shiny apps. So you've got my screen up shared, haven't you? You can see the learning outcomes and the chapter text.
Your answer.
Yeah. So the learning outcomes for chapter 9 are about the importance of prototyping, about the value that it brings into and kind of what purpose it provides, because quite reasonably you could identify a difficult part of the code that you feel that you need to solve immediately and just get started with that, and then, you know, a month might pass, 2 months might pass, and you don't have something that you can present. And even when you do present your code, you might have kind of eventually integrated everything together. You might have missed an important point that the client was trying to get across to you, or that, you know, there may be features missing, or there may be issues with the user interface and things like that you could have caught much earlier had you had a lightweight version of the app that you could show to the client that displays how the, you know, the look and feel of the whole thing. And also, if you work in that way where you kind of try and build everything, it makes it harder to bring extra people into a project. If you can, one of the values that's highlighted in this chapter of prototyping is that you can segregate, certainly for a Shiny app, you can segregate the front end work and whatever styling and things that you might need to write for that from the back end work, you know, the code that's manipulating the data sets and constructing graphs and tables and things like that. And also separate both of those two sides from the reactive code that kind of connects choices made at the user interface to computation performed at the back end. And by splitting up, by kind of separating out the different parts of your app, it makes it easier to ask developers to work on one particular aspect of the app. It separates up the work more easily. So there's benefits for the client in that you can, by providing, say, a prototype of the user interface, you can get feedback on just that from them. And they, the way that they build this prototype here is to kind of use randomized graphs and randomized tables and stuff. And you can explain to the client that this isn't their own data. So to kind of ignore how the data is presented and just focus on the user interface. Or you can present them with a PDF or an HTML markdown type document where they can view data manipulation and data presentation type stuff before that reactivity. So it's a way of kind of focusing the client, it's a way of splitting up the work, and it's a way of getting more rapid feedback on what you're building. The tools mentioned in this chapter are a package I find quite hard to say. It's a kind of lorem ipsum for data focused apps. So it's shiny ipsum. It kind of generates randomized graphs or randomized tables or randomized text and stuff that you can use in your app. Fakir, which is a it's like 3 sets of faked data that you can use in your app, but R provides a variety of other data sets that you can readily use in an app, be it empty cars or the Palmer penguins or something like that you can.
Yeah, or iris and diamonds. Yeah.
And yes, they mentioned use vignette, but so I'll get into that. Prototyping. The importance of prototyping highlighted in the chapter is about making things work before you focus on the low level detail of everything. So making your app look like a kind of eventual version of itself before you've plugged together the front end, the back end, and the reactivity and everything. It is a way of limiting. It's quite easy to get into the habit of trying to write the perfect function before you necessarily need to even write a function. So it's a way of kind of preventing yourself from introducing too much abstraction too early, because for a statement in the chapter is that that abstraction is hard and it makes the code base harder to work with, which I'll admit it is hard, but I wouldn't necessarily say it makes the code base harder to work with, but I think it's quite easy to get too far down a design such that when you realize that the design you've built isn't necessarily perfect for all the choices that you need, for all the features that you require in the app. It's quite hard to backtrack sometimes if you've designed too much, or if you've already written too much abstraction of the code.
There's another piece to this too, and I don't know if you caught the post. It was from, I believe it was a university, but it was 2 professors and they were working on a Shiny app. and they found, or they posted asking questions to the RStats community if anybody else had witnessed this particular error before. What ended up happening was that one user was using a version of RStudio and then compiling and generating the output versus another version of RStudio compiling and generating the output. And so the code base that they were both working off of, identical code base, had two different effects on the output of this particular, I don't know if it was a module or widget or a function, whatever the case was, but it failed on them. And it was, I think it was related to the R markdown, if I'm not mistaken. Wow. Anyway, once they realized that it was just a configuration problem and they had to come back and correct it, then it kept working. But it was a very simple oversight, but it had a dramatic effect on the two users collaborating. I thought that was a great article. I'll try to find it and repost it.
Quite interesting to read, because
certainly
things like the next chapter they talk about managing dependencies, and presumably they'll talk about it again later in the deployment chapter. And there is always a balancing act to be made with tools that manage dependencies. If you pin yourself to working on R 4.1.0, say, and with a particular version of Shiny and a particular version of Golem and whatnot, you can get quite comfortable in there and build a kind of development environment, and all your tests are passing and things like that. And then if you need to introduce an update or a new package or something to that, say, RN environment or packrat environment or something, because you've restricted yourself and you're not updating packages as frequently as you might, because you've got a locked down environment within which you and your team are working, it's quite easy for breaking changes to be introduced into packages that will influence your app if you need to update. So it is quite important to, it's a balancing act in that it's good to have a lockdown environment, but it's also good to ensure that your app will run in the most recent versions of in whichever environment it's built from, because anyway, so back to prototyping. Sorry, I'm going off on tangents already. Yes, it's hard to identify bottlenecks up front, and this is something that you'll come back to in our code, in every different type of R code. So there's lots of kind of rules of thumb within our programming about, avoiding for loops and things like that, and kind of separating side effects from processing and whatnot. But it's very hard to look at a piece of code that runs slowly, or that doesn't quite do what it's supposed to do, or something like that, and pinpoint precisely where it's going wrong without without good tests and without debugging and things like that. And particularly for identifying, bottlenecks usually indicates time lags, or running out of memory or something like that. And without good profiling tools, it's quite hard to do that. And one thing that prototyping provides you is a way to, if you only gradually introduce reactivity, and reactivity turns out to be a bottleneck because, when a user clicks, selects a particular option in the app, it sets off a chain of multiple things changing. That means that it takes a long time to update a figure or update a table or something. By having a prototype that you gradually introduce that kind of reactivity thing, will be a bit easier to identify where bottlenecks are coming in if you're piecemeal bringing the app together. But I think, on this front, profiling tools are probably still the best way to approach this. And also, it's easier to spot mistakes when you've got something that can run, even if that isn't the final anticipated product. So they talk about two different means of prototyping, and the talk about a UI first approach, and this is the purpose of this. So it's to write your user interface code and write as little of the server side of a Shiny app as is needed to make an app that simply runs in the browser. And by having a UI first approach, you can easily get a client in front of it to say, well, that button shouldn't be there. Where's the download button? Could you fix the color scheme and things like that? And and it helps the team to understand how the app is supposed to work when it's in the hands of a user, and also helps partition up the work that different team members need to contribute to. I think it also helps to get a Shiny app that can simply be deployed, even if it's not deployed with all the databases and all the reactivity and things like that it needs in its final form. If you can get to a deployable state, even if what is deployed isn't the final entity, you can start working on things like deployment pipelines and continuous integration pipelines, which will help in terms of how rapidly you can integrate features, how rapidly you can get feedback, and help embed kind of testing and validation and stuff into your pipeline.
It's the easy structure, the easy scaffolding, and then you just start to populate the rest of the features, right, or tweaking it to be the end goal. You want to get the working prototype functioning, or I like your comment about the UI first. So being able to get feedback from your customer prior to actually going into more of a laborious function of server-side code or how it's managed, right, or optimizing the calls from UI to server. Being able to at least showcase that the application works builds confidence both in the team and also in the customer that you are heading in the right direction.
Yeah, cool. Yes, so I'll move on from there. So for Shiny specifically, they mentioned this package, Shiny ipsum. Where are we? Fast UI prototyping. So there are a couple of example apps that use this, and like I was saying earlier on, this is it's a tool for generating random elements. So for example, you could generate a random graph. I've got an example of it here. Yeah, if I pull our studio over, and so this is generate me a random ggplot thing and add this particular title to it, and that will run. And you have in the viewer, you've got a random kind of level plot thing that can, and with that you can put that straight into your kind of wireframe app that your prototype app that you're building. There's a range of different apps mentioned in the chapter. So oh, that's funny. Okay, Yeah, I'll follow this one instead then. None of the links work.
No, that first one didn't seem to add up, but I was going to tell you. So this one, if you refresh the browser and give it just a little bit of time, it'll actually randomize your plotting. It takes a little bit to reprocess or refresh, but I thought that was kind of neat.
Yeah, that is. So you've got a plot and some text and a table, and yeah, no, it is very neat. It's that's strange. I'll kind of.
So by using this particular ipsum package, you're able to prototype the code base to at least show the user the intent of what the app is going to do. Whereas instead of using actual real data or processing, you're just getting I keep coming back to the scaffolding, and I'm sorry, I keep using that term over again, but when I use the word scaffolding, I'm thinking you've got the important pillars or the blocks that are required to build the foundation of what you're trying to get at or compile. And by having that working, functioning application, regardless of its fictitious data, at least you know that the system is operating as intended or as you had designed it. I've got a quick question or just kind of a debate on that comment, but I'll wait. I'll let you keep going, and I'll come back to that statement again.
Okay. Well, I've only got one more section really of this chapter to talk about. So yes, they also mentioned Fakir, but Fakir itself, to be honest, I found it somewhat underwhelming, and to be honest, I think I'd rather use the actual data sets that R provides, or mock-up data that looks more similar to the thing that I'm actually working on, than try and elbow because the data sets that are contained within that are quite different from the kinds of things that I'm typically working with. So that's an alternative tool for help building a prototype app. So yes, this is a text-heavy set of notes. I've not got any apps in here. So the final section of the chapter I found quite interesting, where it discusses so the back-end logic, the kind of things that you would put in your R subdirectory as functions, as outside of a module, so outside of any reactive context. Really, when you're coding up a Shiny app, you want as little content as possible in the server function, or the equivalent to the server function within a module, and much more of it pushed out into functions that perform the kind of processing and things that can be tested outside of a reactive context. And it's that kind of non-reactive processing that is done on the server side, which this approach to prototyping using an R Markdown document or within a vignette, I found really quite interesting. And to be honest, it's not an approach I had even considered until reading this book, despite having written many reports in Markdown and stuff in the past. So the aim is to build out the back end without any reactive context. And what you also generate from that, because you would be writing these R Markdown, because you're working within a package structure, the sensible place for this kind of long form documentation, the R Markdowns, is in the vignettes directory, or in the old time inst equivalent of that. And because you're working in a package, you have access to the dev tools and document my package type workflows that are available to package authors.
I was almost going to say, with the use of that vignette, what I find in reading that context versus just the package intent, right, or the calls, the functions that you can use within the package, I find that you are closer associated with the intent of the developer that wrote that particular function call. You comprehend or understand what they were intending to do in that notes form of taking versus here's the function call and then here's an example of what it's supposed to do. That doesn't always help. By reading a developer's notes, you're getting closer to how they came up with that particular function call or the reason that they used that syntax or subject.
Yes. No, I do agree. It is quite useful. This is why I quite like, when I'm learning how to use a new package, I quite often look at the tests, because they, you can see the intent of how a function is typically used, and the kind of data you would build before calling the functions within that package. And the vignettes, I mean, typically when I'm learning a new package, I would skip through the vignettes at quite a pace and come back to the bits that are relevant to what I'm actually working on. But yeah, I can see how this would be useful. And also because, there would typically be multiple people working on an app at any one time. You can have two people working on two separate vignettes at the same time. If there's a commonality to the code that they're writing, it's a good place to identify that and maybe generate a function that could be put into the exportable content of the package. So that, if I'm writing a kind of read, clean, combine step in my vignette, and you're writing something similar in yours, it would be a good point to kind of work out what the commonalities are, merge them, write better, kind of, a more extensive version of the functions. Yes, and it's a good way to demonstrate how the different analytical or kind of graphical elements within the Ultimate app are generated from the code within. But again, because you're working in a markdown document, you're not thinking about the reactive stuff, you're not thinking about the UI stuff. And that means that you can focus on the algorithms underlying everything. I like this idea of using them as a lab notebook, because in my experience, it doesn't really gel well in a version control environment to use things as a lab notebook, because you end up kind of rewriting and you can, although you can trace back the history of a document within Git, it's not an easy way to navigate someone's kind of thought processes. So maybe by having kind of date stamped entries within the vignettes, you can keep track of your ideas better. But I don't know, I find that quite a jarring way of working in a version controlled environment. But anyway, yes, and also, like I was saying earlier on, the packages have good tooling for building long form documentation as part of the package build and install things. So the R command check or DevTools check, or however you choose to use that, can build your vignettes during the package build steps. and provide an automated check that the content therein continues to work as the app's code develops. So there's a more kind of long form testing of the content that's gone into the app. Yeah, I thought that was a really neat way of prototyping the back end work that underlies a Shiny app. Sorry, you had a point that you wanted to raise again then.
Well, I was going to go back to the previous slide, and in relation to using ipsum or the how did you pronounce the word for it? I'm calling it. Yes. Well, I'm saying faker is how I'm pronouncing that. But anyway, it's false data. But the comment I was making about using the ipsum, so if the intent of this chapter 9 is for prototyping, getting a working application so that the customer and the team can start fine-tuning the application, the thought that came to mind was, okay, you've got a application, we'll call it this ipsum package, and that it generates a code base that you're happy with. You find that you're excited for this one awesome function call. Then you go and actually look at the code that was randomly generated and then try to meld it into your own application. I always find error in using random type applications to build code base. And the reason I'm saying this is from the developer's perspective, or we'll just use Golem as an example. So Golem has these hooks, these points where you would generate, or if ipsum generates this additional code base, then try to shoehorn or fit it into an application that you're building. I always find this disruptive point of modifying the previous generated code and then having things break. And it could be me, it could be anybody that's also doing this same application. I'm very cautious of copy and paste, and I'm very cautious of just using an application but scratching my head because I'm not really sure what it does, right? Or how it actually works. How did it render this particular plot? Because the way the code base is written, it shouldn't work, or it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Does it make sense? And I don't know if you've ran into any of that similar profile, or maybe it could be just my current maturity level in the subject of this production level or engineering level.
I don't really know, to be honest. I mean, I kind of. Oh, sorry, the dog's going a bit crazy.
No worries. If you were to randomly generate an application that you were happy with, right? I don't know, maybe we'll use something that from the Mastering Shiny, code snippet block, and you really like what it does, you're really happy with what it does, but then you try to use that code in your own framework and then realize this isn't going to work, or I don't understand the intricacies of how it actually applies. You can't deploy it because it's broken code or it's giving you error, and you spend infinite amounts of time trying to comprehend what that snippet is doing in relation to the application. I just find it disruptive, and I'm trying to be devil's advocate with supporting what the author is stating in chapter 9, while also saying that I've attempted that before, following a perfect model, and then everything just starts to crumble down. Or I get this inherent frustration of, I know it works this way, but if I deploy it on this other side, it doesn't work, and I don't know why. I don't. So you're trying to I don't know, re-engineer or get behind the scenes of exactly what's happening. I don't know if anybody else follows that same thought. It could just be the way my connection of how all of these calls are making occur.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, certainly. I mean, I am probably guilty of using functions and code and things that do things that I don't necessarily understand the ins and outs of. But I think, I don't know, I remember reading a book where it was basically, it described how at the level that you program, you need to know you need to know a lot of detail about that, that stuff. But there will be stuff at a lower level and stuff at a higher level that you don't necessarily know nearly as much about. So, for example, within R, you might know the syntax for matrix multiplication and things like that, but not necessarily know the details of the Fortran or C that underpins the matrix multiplication that you perform. Similarly, in Shiny, I have copied and pasted, HTML attributes from one place into another place without necessarily knowing whether I'm manipulating something that's provided by Bootstrap or something that's Shiny's defined as a JavaScript thing or something like that. Yeah, so there are levels that I don't know a great deal about, and it's not like a blissful ignorance. It's just that you don't necessarily have the time to know everything or necessarily have the background to understand everything that you're working in. But
that definitely gives me confidence that I'm not alone, and that that brainwave of it's not frustration, or it's not being naive like you had stated. It's kind of a I don't know if this will work. Let's just try it and see, and then we'll wrangle it as needed. I don't know. I always think of like mapping, right? So you've got your atlas, you've got your compass, and I need to get from point A to point B, but I have no idea exactly where I'm at or the terrain. All I've got is this map and my compass, and so the intent is to try and get from point A to point B, but I have no idea what I'm going to expect in the terrain. Just maybe a really poor analogy of kind of the coding or prototyping type thought process. So,
sure. Right. So I might try and cover some of the content from chapter 10. I don't know whether I'll get over it all, but it was quite a golem focused chapter, and it probably doesn't have so much to discuss as maybe the previous chapter did. So again, we've got some learning outcomes in terms of, and also a lot of the content in this chapter is expanded upon in subsequent chapters. So we have dependency management in terms of the packages that you depend upon, and also in terms of, say, the CSS and JavaScript and stuff that you are importing or that you've copied into your static directories and what. So this is about building the app. So once you've got a prototype in place, how do you then rewrite or decompose that prototype into a more workable thing? So you may have the UI has been green lighted. You may have the kind of back end markdown vignette stuff has been documented, and you're now in the stage of kind of connecting reactive user input type stuff from the UI cut to those back-end elements that you've already written in place. So there's stuff about how you split up your code into modules and sub-modules, and similarly into functions and utilities and whatnot, using tools that Golem provides. How to organize your functions so that the next developer who comes in to take over from you knows where to find things that are relevant to the area of the app that they need to work on. Then there's a bit of kind of probably a bit holier than thou about testing in here, about nothing should be sent to production without being tested or something. I think was the quote in this. It was either in this chapter or in a subsequent chapter on testing, and I can't help but think that it's really not the case at all. That there's an awful lot of Shiny apps, and an awful lot of apps in general have been pushed to production where the vast majority of the code has not been tested. And also there's a bit of stuff on automating kind of continuous integration steps. So a lot of this, how you organize your functions, how you test things, and the automation, it isn't just relevant to Shiny, it's kind of relevant to how you'd build an R package in general, or, you know, from the CI and CD side, it would be relevant, you know, if you were building a Flask app or a Django app or something as well. Golem provides some tools for dealing with, so this is, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. These are the tools and the packages that are mentioned within the chapter. So attachment is for identifying package dependencies that are within your code that you may not yet have added as explicit dependencies of your app. The Golem add function or utils or module functions are there to ensure that your functions and your module code are added in a consistent way. So these generate files that are named a specific way. So these are tools that you would typically use as a package developer. So this is use package and use test and use vignette, all of which you get accustomed to using as a package developer. So use package, say, would be to add a dependency on a particular package, and it would add a line to your description file to say that that's the code within here is dependent on that package. DevTools provides some tools for building vignettes and whatnot, and these various tools are for test coverage and things. So I'll get on to dependency management as well. Right. So I think there does seem to have been a bit of repetition in some of the earlier chapters and in here as well. So the content of a description and a namespace file. So the description defines which packages you need to install in order to use the code that is within the current package. The namespace file defines those functions that are exported by this package, and those functions are, and within the dependencies of this package, which functions from there do you depend upon while your package code is running. And the purpose of the namespace file is to help you avoid things like conflicts. So if I say that my package depends upon JSON Lite and also on per, if I use a function called flatten without explicitly saying that it's JSON Lite flatten or per flatten, it won't, there'll be a conflict, and it will be hard to determine precisely which version of flatten you're using, were it not for the namespacing that R provides. And also there are tools like Roxygen 2 to add documentation to all your functions and things like that that you can also use to state whether, you know, there's an import from annotation that you can add, say, that would say import from JSON Lite flatten, so that within your package, whenever you call flatten without an explicit package then function call, it would use JSON Lite's flatten function.
That makes total sense.
Yeah. So this is just, these are tools provided for package authors, but which are valuable to you as an author of an app that depends on golem, and it's implied package structure that you ought to be using. Organizing your functions, one of the bugbears for me of R as a package author is that it's nigh on and I find it hard. I find it worse as an app developer than I did as a package author, because if you end up with too much content in a package, you can just split that package into two, or one main one and a helper that you import or something like that. With an app, it's quite easy to end up with dozens of files within your R directory. And without a good naming convention, it can get very hard to manage what files are present and what each file does.
If you don't mind me adding to a statement in relation to that this page and the comment you had or just stated, I look at Node.js. If you've ever done any development with Node, it is very difficult to map dependencies of all of the various content within a version of Node. Does that make sense? Like, so you're building an application, you rely on all these different Node versions, et cetera, and then the code base changes. You update Node, and then your entire app breaks, and you have to remap it back to what it was previously, whatever time frame was. I find that within R and the application constantly, bunch of developers all coming together to build these packages that you are reliant on. I haven't used our environment yet, and I don't believe it's called in this book, or I don't remember reading it anywhere, but there's been some discussion about lock-in, like the R environment lock-in. I find that these services, whether it be the description or the namespace, as being a pseudo application that does the same thing. So what version of the package and direct call to a function within that package, so that your app continuously runs. Am I reiterating or just stating your comment over again?
That's
okay.
That's it.
Yeah.
Sorry, but the thing that really frustrates me is that you can only have an R directory. You can't have an R IO directory. You can't have an R and then a subdirectory for data cleaning or something like that, and an R sub graphics or something like that, which would be really, really helpful in an app from my perspective, because I can readily end up with loads of different graphics files and loads of different data processing files in an app, and it's quite hard to navigate. Now, if you go back 2 or 3 years ago, when people before they added the before they made Shiny apps more consistent with package structure, and made it such that if you have an R directory, any content within that will automatically be brought into the namespace in which your app runs. People were writing apps where you'd have at the top level of your source tree, you'd have say a modules directory and a UI directory that contains, the functions that go into building the UI and whatnot. And in some ways that was quite a nice way of structuring an app, but it did mean that you'd have to call source UI / buttons.r or something like that. And the source function I've always found to be a harbinger of bad code lies here. But yeah, but there was quite a nice, it was quite nice that you could you know, you will end up with lots of files in in a Shiny app, but you can put them into sensible directories, and you can't really do that and structure your app as a package. You can only really put your functions and your object definitions and stuff in the R directory. So you have to be very kind of, you have to be consistent from the get-go about how you're going to name them things. Whether FCT is a nice prefix, I don't think it really is. But what Golem provides is, you know, if you are writing utils for date manipulation, or functions for database access, or functions for file IO, or something like that, it provides you a coherent way of naming those files. Similarly, but the module stuff gets a bit more complicated. So if you've got module say you've got a module for a particular tab within a multi-tab page, it's got some functions for generating the table that you display on that tab, and another function for generating the UI that contains the text that explains how that table was made. So you'll end up, for that module, you might have a function for the table, a function for the text, and things like that. So what was a single module file now becomes 5 or 6 files, and that's just for one tab. So I don't know whether, it just seems that the way that a package structure, the way that package structure is imposed upon a Shiny app means that you end up with tons of files. But I quite like this system that Golem provides. So for example, you can, if you're adding a module and you know that you'll need functions for a particular type of entity and various utilities, you can create those function files and those utility files at the same time as you're generating a module. Similarly, you can add those functions to a module that pre-exists, and it will name things. You'll have the module name first, and then the types of functions that you're writing second. So it will be, it's kind of topic oriented. So the module would be, you know, COVID infections this week. The second module might be kind of population, I don't know, population numbers across the countries or something like that. So it's by, you've got the modules are separated by topic, and then within them you've got functions that might, rather than having the top level being, you know, functions for file handling and then modules. So I don't know. It makes sense to me. But,
no, it does. No,
there
I'm
are
100%.
alternative ways of decomposing things that also make sense.
Yeah. Well, but that's part of the automated naming convention then, correct? So it's not by forcing, or I won't use the word force, by implying that you allow the computer to name the code base, the namespace variable remains consistent. So you're not introducing the human brain thought process of just naming whatever you want and not really sure if the function calls in the running app start to break. By allowing it to be automated, or this naming convention. I like the comment you made about the R file, because that's kind of a dumping ground, right? That's where it stops. The automated namespace stops at that point, and then it just creates this huge pool of, you know, extra things that you may or may not comprehend how that applies. Within the module and the utilities calls, the function of the file naming convention, or automated file naming convention, maintains the order of precedence to the namespace link of where that function lives and how it's called upon. Am I making sense, or am I?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Yeah.
Well, I find a lot of times, especially when you have very complex documentation or very complex compiling of anything, code base or anything else, if the individual is allowed to name whatever they want, you're going to find that it's, it becomes this almost unruly sort of application if you allow the computer to name following a schema or this lock-in of how it's applied. Then as a bundled package management function, the namespace is also maintained. I may just be repeating myself or stating a fact that.
That's fine. Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah. And then there's a whole new set of naming conventions for tests as well. Now, so the tests directory of a package contains things like, this would be where you'd test your R functions, not necessarily where you would test, say, if you were wrapping up an R package that contains some C code, you wouldn't put the tests for your C implementation in the R tests directory. Similarly, you wouldn't necessarily put Puppeteer or I always forget the other one. Anyway, you wouldn't put your kind of front-end driven tests within the tests directory of your app. But yeah, so use this provides a little helper function to build an appropriately named test file for a particular behavior or function that you're wanting to test within your app. So yeah, so there's that, and this is just unit testing and things like that. Within a later section, they talk about code coverage and continuous integration. It seemed a strange way of partitioning the content to me, but so we talked about the vignettes earlier on. Code coverage. Now, one of the great benefits of the package structure that Golem imposes upon an app is that basically every development tool that has been designed for package developers is now automatically available to you. Things like code coverage work without any hiccups, provided your R tests work appropriately when you run, DevTools test or test that test package, or when you then use coverage and COVR, which cover package coverage. When you use these functions to test coverage, they should work automatically on any code that's within your R directory. Yeah, I'll not discuss my opinions on testing and what level it should be done and things like that. But yes, so code coverage works for you out of the box if your app is in a package structure. In past, I've tried to get coverage to work in a non-packaged Shiny app, and I find it quite hard to do, to be honest, even though tests run fine and things like that. But in addition to code coverage and stuff, you've got linting, you've got styling, and all these other things, and kind of CI tools, and you've got package down for automatically deploying your man pages as a website and things like that, which are wonderful tools. And if they're appropriate to your app, it would save you, hours of work that these tools already exist. That's the great benefit to me of the package structure that Golem imposes upon you, and which you had golem not existed, you could have generated a package and generated a shiny app using a package structure, but that golem kind of forces you to it is kind of helpful in the long run, I think. There's a small section on continuous integration, and I think they probably talk about it in a bit more detail in the deployment chapter. But so there's various different providers for CI tools. Use This has a little function from which you gain access to CI testing infrastructure and linting infrastructure and things like that for GitHub actions that have already been written by the community. So again, with the package structure and the efforts of the community that already have been put in place, you have access to various things. And I've seen similar stuff for like kind of automatic deployment to say Shiny. Well, I think it was to RS Connect, but the same kind of reasoning exists. But yeah, this chapter really, it just highlighted tools that are available or nice little helper functions that Golem provides to more consistently apply, you know, to a Shiny app. But it's helpful kind of revision of what's available within the R package infrastructure and what how best to organize your apps code for future use. But I don't think there's much to discuss, to be honest, in this chapter.
Gotcha. I did like, well, the statement you made or what the author was implying is that the CI/CD process, you can utilize multiple CI/CD.
Muted for me.
I'm sorry, did it not?
What's the other thing?
Are you able to hear me okay?
Sorry. Have I pulled out something? Sorry, Ryan, I've lost. Oh yeah, there we go. Sorry,
Okay.
Your audio.
No worries. What I was implying was the CI/CD process of multiple tools that are pre-existing or available to developers. The code base or the packaging process automatically implies that it's going to plug into these other applications. I would just quickly go back and reiterate the statement about the Travis CI and the GitHub debacle of potentially deploying security keys to the world. But I've tested a couple of these different various CI/CD processes. I need to gain some more familiarity and utilizing or deploying in those tools so that because it again, with great power comes great responsibility. Comprehending what that workflow looks like and the testing features that the code base is required as it is deployed again, right? It's just this constant innovation. You make a change and then it recompiles everything for you. That application is, I'm scratching my head at, and I don't think I'm alone in comprehension. Coming from a very academia sort of standpoint, and you know what was learned in college or in applications, excuse me, a particular course, and then now you're out in the wild and you get these other opportunities. What you're familiar with in one case versus what the rest of the world is using. I always like to saturate or understand how that tool is deployed, what is unique about it, why does the community seem to gravitate towards that tool more so than others. And I was going to just quickly extend one last statement. So in 2019, Microsoft acquired GitHub, and there was a huge amount of disruption within the open source community of
a lot of distrust of Microsoft.
Exactly. Now your code base or what you're developing is now, you know, integrated into potentially other users viewing what you're developing. There's a migration to other version control or other storage services. GitLab is what I'm referring to. Between GitHub and GitLab has more of a integrated CI/CD workflow right out of the box. GitHub, you have to use external third-party tools to do the same point. And I didn't know if you wanted to share your own thoughts in that respect, or if my rhetorical question is too open-ended or too vague.
I don't know. I mean, I like 4 or 5 years ago, I was using Travis on all of the packages I was working on, then migrated to use them with GitHub, where, you know, for those packages that I continued to work on. And still, I mean, I keep all my open source work on GitHub, but the firm that I work for now uses GitLab for CI for virtually everything. It's only when a client is on Bitbucket or is on GitHub already that we use their tools. But I mean, and there is notable differences in the syntax and things for the CI tools, but they're largely doing the same kind of thing. And you know what the thought process is involved in building a CI pipeline for one usually translate okay. But I don't have any particular I don't see any particular benefit of GitLab CI over GitHub Actions at present, because I mean, GitHub Actions have worked out pretty well for me over the past year. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, and certainly the issue regarding Microsoft's influence over GitHub, I don't know. It didn't pan out as being a huge problem. I mean, obviously there's this what's it called, the kind of code bot that kind of that's been trained against GitHub repositories to fill in kind of to propose code that you might fill in. I can see there being dangers there and whatnot, but I don't know, it hasn't proved to be a problematic thing for me.
That may, and again, I know I'm of a junior stature of these topics or the engineering production level. The learning process, I know that I need to expand in comprehension of these other utilities and services to really have an opinionated.
Oh yeah, I feel the same way, to be honest.
Yeah.
Because like, you know, like I'm largely R focused, but like you have to kind of know, you have to know bits about, like, to do anything with the CI tools, you need to know a little bit about Docker, and you need to know a little bit about kind of the you know, command line work and things like that. And you know, there's learning at every scale. So yeah,
good point.
I mean, it's good in some way. Anyway, I really am gonna have to head off, I'm afraid.
You're okay.
But, yeah, cheers for turning out today and discussing chapter 9 and 10 with us. Right, so I'll see you next week, I think, because I'm sure that the daylight savings, the issue is 2 or 3 weeks away.
Agreed.
But yeah, next week we'll try and do chapter 11. I have been approaching a couple of people to take us through their own use of Golem as a kind of
that'd be amazing, yeah, to actually see a working app or
thing. Yeah,
agreed.
Anyway, right, I'll catch you next week.
All right, thanks, Russ. Have a great day.
See you later. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Oh no, I've not exited here. Where am I? Stop share.